This is the Writers Podcast, a Writers After Dark radio production, bringing you the best in writing advice, news, trends, and interviews. Hosted by award-winning authors S.K. Anthony and Raymond Esposito.
Hello and welcome to the Writers Podcast. I'm Raymond Esposito, and I'm here with my co-host, S. Catherine Anthony. Hey, Catherine, before I let you talk, I want to make two disclosures. The first is we're both suffering from summer flu, so we're just troopers doing this. And yes. The second is, you know, when people hear an episode like the one we're about to do, it sounds like we're in agreement on a lot of things, but we've literally spent hours arguing over the advice that is in this podcast.
I wouldn't say the advice, more in the structure, how we wanted to present it.
See, we're even arguing over whether it's advice or structure.
Yes, because you're getting it wrong again.
It doesn't end.
All right, but you know what? Forget that.
Okay.
Let's start from scratch. Hello again, and take 22. Let's go.
Let's go. So let me ask you a question. How many times have you picked up a book, read the first lines, and said, nope, next?
Oh, goodness, I can't even tell you. Well, you know, as writers, our greatest, most important challenge is to hook that reader, which is why the opening of our novels are by far the most crucial sentences that any writer will write.
Yeah, we may believe or hope that we have 70,000 words to express the story that we want to tell, but in truth, the process begins in the first pages and with the first words written.
Yeah, and each step thereafter, the reader makes a subsequent reevaluation to either fall deeper into the story world or, to close the book.
Yeah, hey, listen, it doesn't sound fair that we're given so little time to make that impression, but the hard truth is whether you're hooking the bookstore browser, a look-in-sighty from Amazon, or a literary agent, you have a very small window to impress upon them the idea that your story is worth the investment of their time.
And unfortunately for us, gosh, they close those pages real fast.
Hey, do you like that word I made up? A look inside.
Yes, I was going to ask about that, but then you were still talking and I didn't feel like interrupting you, but insidey.
I just feel as writers we can make words up.
You just like to be a make stuff upper.
Mm-hmm. Hey, but the burden of the journey, that journey to get them to keep reading, is on the writer. Through craft and style, it is the writer who must keep the reader absorbed and engaged because the writer needs the reader.
Yeah, they desire that connection between those pages and the reader. We all know that. And we want to pull them into that world to see the colors, experience the feelings, and share their thoughts.
And the good news is the reader is a willing partner. They want to connect with the story. They want to listen. They want to make that exploration.
And great openings have that. They have the power to entice your reader enough that it would be unthinkable to set the book down.
It's a lot of pressure, but that's the writer's reality. Readers have plenty of books to choose from, and that's the bottom line.
So here's an example of history's best-selling book and an opening that gets right to the action. But I want to use, Mr. Voiceover over there. So come on, Raymond, do your thing.
Here's my voiceover voice.
He wanted the intro.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Hey, whether or not you're a Christian or subscribe to the Bible as a divine document, or simply a part of history, there's no doubt this is an incredibly powerful opening.
Which is why the Bible has been on the bestseller list for over 2,000 years.
Yes, so as you can see, this proves our point. Beginnings matter.
Yes.
Literally the beginning of beginnings. But anyway, even if it was in Genesis, I'd be hooked. I don't know about you.
Absolutely. And the opening is critical. And it's critical because...
Well, we only get one chance to hook our readers, to pull them in, to ensure they must read on. That's why so many writers panic over how to start writing the first few pages of a novel.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes writer's block is just that first line. But you know what? Let's take a breath, because it's not necessary to tell your reader the entire story in the first page. You just need to draw their attention to that first sentence, and then the next, and then the next, and then the rest of your paragraph.
And when it works, it is incredible. Think about it. How often have you stayed up far too late with a book so that you could read just one more chapter? Well, that's what we want as writers. We want our readers to walk into work yawning, exhausted, and the need of intravenous coffee to survive the day, all thanks to our books. I mean, yeah, it's kind of irresponsible, but hey, I still think that's a good goal to have.
Sure. I don't mind people having sleepless nights if it's my book they're reading. But openings are important because often a story isn't read simply because it bores the impatient reader. You know, there was a time when you might be able to enjoy your 15 minutes of fame, but the world moves faster. Fame is measured in the 6-second intervals that we were allowed on the old Vine videos, and your story is like that. You have very little time to earn the reader's engagement.
Yeah, and the sad fact is that as a new writer, most of us are not prepared for that kind of requirement. Okay, sure, readers might give us a little more than 6 seconds, but every marketer knows that each line needs to give reason for the reader to go to that next line.
And that's not something that's really a concern once you're famous. There are best-selling authors who could publish their grocery list and people would probably stand in line to buy it.
Yeah.
They have that level of credibility. The fans already know that they're probably going to like that person's story, so they'll make that bigger time investment. They'll offer the author more pages, so to speak.
Yeah, but new and especially independent authors, they have to compete for that limited attention of the readers.
So how do you write the killer opening?
You know, a lot has been said on that subject, so much so that it can get a bit confusing. Obviously, we know we want a great opener, but how do we learn the skill and what are the magic ingredients?
Well, unfortunately, to that question, there's no formula for the perfect opener.
None.
The good thing is that great writers have been creating them for centuries. So we do have insights to share based on those great works.
And just as with any writing advice, the key is to do what you believe will work best for your story and for the way you want to reveal your secrets.
And writers love their secrets. They sometimes marvel at their own mastery of words.
Yes, they do.
But I've seen this often in book recommendations that read, oh, well, once you get through the first couple of chapters, the story is great. And whenever I see that, I think, oh boy, that's really bad. I mean, again, maybe not for a well-known author, but certainly for a new author.
Yeah, well-known authors became such because they mastered the opening of their books. One secret is that they hook the reader by using statements that create questions that the reader wanted to answer.
And in others, they tend to avoid spending too much time with opening backstories, info dumps, or long descriptive texts. In other words, they get right to the action.
But sometimes the effective opening seems so for the wrong reasons.
Yes, one of the most famous and controversial openings in modern literature is Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury.
It's the bane of every student, and although it seems contrary to our advice to create a question in the reader's mind, it is actually spot on.
Yeah, the book's opening is confusing and difficult to figure out. Later, we learn that the reason for that is that it's being narrated by a mentally challenged character.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating.
Or annoying, but the point is we're getting his perspective on the world, which is a bit confusing. And although students mostly hate that opening, it effectively raises the questions the reader wants answered. In this case, those questions are, what the hell is going on here and why is this garbage considered a classic?
Didn't you tell me Faulkner wanted to do each character part in a different ink color to have the reader along?
Yes, and the publisher said absolutely not, too expensive. But, you know, that desire is a pretty strong indicator that he should have dumbed it all down and gone with clarity. But when looking at beginnings, the process begins with deciding on your opening approach. And one example is there's the prologue approach. It's one of the most popular ways to open a novel. A prologue relates to your story and can serve as a legitimate opening.
It can establish why things are as they are in the story and why the character is the way she is. It can even hint or disclose the danger that's going to enter the main character's life.
But as we all know, when it comes to prologues, the book world is divided. Those who dislike prologues argue that prologues are for the lazy, that it stops you from getting into the action, and of course they say that no one reads them anyways.
You know, I'll admit, I'm sometimes anti-prologues, but that's only because so many authors use it as a way to do info dump for the backstory. And I dislike it, when I come across a scenario. On the other hand, when I read the really good ones, I just love them. But the way I see it, I could say the same for first chapters. So, who knows?
The prologue writers believe that readers do read them. Obviously, that's why they write them, and that they're actually helpful for the setting and setting the tone of the book. Sometimes it's just needed. Think about the first Star Wars or the fourth or however they number the things. But the first one that came out, they had the prologue on the screen, and that was a great way to set us into that world.
Look, yeah, they just recently made a movie of what we would consider the prologue, but when you think about it, was it really needed to have that whole movie in front of the original? No, it wasn't.
Which is why we're going to do an episode on how to plan out a series, because Star Wars is the perfect example of how you get into trouble when you don't give it enough thought. Brothers start kissing sisters.
Oh, you have to go there.
Yeah, well, it's famous.
Well, they're no Lannisters, but they're still bad enough. Look, prologues can both engage and lose your readers. It comes back to your reason for using it. It has to serve a purpose other than information.
I personally love prologues, but instead of calling them prologues, I give them poetic titles. Sometimes just like chapter 1.
I like your sine qua non, or how do you pronounce it? Sine qua non. Or
Sine qua non.
Sine qua non.
Without which this would not be. Yeah.
Yeah, look, okay. And so the next approach is in the middle of things.
Here, you start at a point deep in the story. You show some activity to intrigue the reader, and then you fall back to an earlier, quieter part of the story.
Like hitting the rewind button, and then they use some or the rest of the book catching up to that moment.
It's one of the less common ways to begin a novel, but it can definitely be effective.
Yeah, look, take Twilight by Stephanie Myers. She does this in prologue form, and I don't have quite the voiceover voice like you do, but I'm gonna try to channel my my inner Raymond. That sounds weird. I'm gonna try to channel you.
Channel your inner Bella.
I'd never given much thought to how I would die, though I had recently enough in the last few months. But even if I had, I would not have imagined it like this. I stared without breathing across the long room into the dark eyes of the hunter, and he looked pleasantly back at me. Surely it was a good way to die, in the place of someone else, someone I loved. Noble even. That ought to count for something. I knew that if I'd never gone to Forks, I wouldn't be facing death now. But, terrified as I was, I couldn't bring myself to regret the decision. When life offers you a dream so far beyond any of your expectations, it's not reasonable to grieve when it comes to an end. The hunter smiled in a friendly way as he sauntered forward to kill me.
Okay, I'm not personally a fan of Stephanie Myers, but I do believe that she successfully pulls this off. It does have a classic vampire approach in the sense that Bram Stoker's did. But before anyone decides to start all their books this way, they should just remember that many readers feel this approach is a gimmick, and they feel ripped off when they read it.
Yeah, it's almost like the feeling you get when a story begins with a dream. But even so, I she did it successfully too.
You're also sacrificing suspense of what's to come. So using it is a mixture of enticement and the danger that you'll inspire a been there, seen that response from your readers.
But the payoff is that once you reach that point and you go past it, that tension, it can shoot through the roof for that reader.
Mm-hmm. Now, the third approach is what is called the action approach. And here, the hero is on stage doing something active and interesting related to the launching of the main storyline. If you think about James Bond, nearly every 007 story starts with him performing some intense, daring action scene.
Yeah, the hero action beginning is one of the most common ways to begin a story.
Some stories lend themselves naturally to this approach, but if your hero isn't a hero yet or isn't yet in a position to show it, don't try to force an action beginning.
Both of mine start a little bit with a hero action beginning, although I didn't know that it was, in studying approaches that it was a thing. But anyway, we can all make up something for our heroes to do as the book begins. But if it feels like a stretch or a cliche, we would suggest that you choose another approach.
The fourth and final way is the frame device approach. And this is where your story is bookended on the front and back by a story that's outside of the main story.
Titanic, it's a great example for this. As an audience, we care most about Rose and Jack's love story as we see it unfold. But, we can only access this story through the device of an old woman who's Rose in the present. And there's a minor story going on in the modern day while they're searching for the necklace. But the real story of Titanic is in the historical part. We go back and forth in time, but the story still ends with Rose. It begins and ends with her.
Yeah, a great thing about this approach is you can use it to make large jumps in time, within your primary story.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say there was room for both of them. Jack didn't have to die, but anyway.
She killed him.
But with this approach, you do risk losing your reader's interest, since it can involve characters who are out of the action. If you can pull it off, It would make an amazing reading experience, I think.
Yeah, the challenge here is making the frame or the B story interesting and not making it feel like something we just need to get through. It has to stand on its own, and it has to add something interesting and exciting to the rest. Stephen King's It, he tells two A stories that are simply separated by time and executed perfectly.
But once you've worked out your approach, you can move on to the most important line. That very first line.
The difference between the master storyteller and the writer who just prattles on to empty rooms is the ability to use the words to carry the reader, to magically set them adrift in that fictional world, to engage them with worthwhile events, and to provide characters of interest and value.
And it is a challenge that begins in line 1. It's a modern rehashing of Once Upon a Time. And the masters understand this, and so often their opening lines are literary genius because they make us want to know the why.
Here are some of my favorite examples. Someone must have slandered Joseph K. For one morning without having done anything truly wrong. He was arrested. Franz Kafka. They shoot the white girl first. Toni Morrison, Paradise.
Yes, those are good. I'm not sure what to say about mine. They're not mind-blowing and they're not full of wonder, I don't think. But in my heart, they fit my stories perfectly. In my first novel, Kinetic, first line was midnight. Finally, the fun begins. And Static, my first line, it's really, really long. It's simply, it began.
How long did it take you to? How long did it take you to pull together? It began. I mean, I love it. It's perfect because it's.
I probably had like 100 versions before I settled on it began.
You know what though? As simple as is, it's powerful to because it raises the question. It is so important that we announce that it began, and I think the other, the other night, midnight, when the fun begins. It reflects the character that you immediately introduce us to, Annie, and her fighting skills and her super strength. So I think that works.
Yeah. What about yours? Share a couple of yours with us.
So I think my two out of my 4 books, my 2 favorite is The Devil's Hour, which begins, "My name is Samuel Drake, and this is my final statement." And my second favorite is from the beginning of Beneath the Gathering Storm, which is a little bit more of the poetic approach, where it says, "Dreams are so often the province of children and fools."
Those were great. My favorite one of yours, though, is from your second book, All Our Foolish Schemes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to read it for you just in case you forgot what you wrote.
Which is really possible.
Oh, yes. The caravan travels with a somberness that reflects their dead world. I mean, wow.
Yeah, I can like it too.
Pretty cool. I love that one. But another example, moving on from our own books and our own plugins.
Mm-hmm.
Hey. I like.
Hey, but just to stop you on that, because I know we were just talking about our own books, and that can seem self-serving, but I think the whole point of that is, if you're not totally in love with your first line, if you don't like cheer it, if you're not like, that is it. If you're not jumping up from your desk and saying, "I nailed it, that's it, it's a one-line story," I don't think you've arrived. I don't think you got it. Go back and work on it until you're jumping on your desk saying, "This is the best first line ever written."
No, that's true. And now I feel silly because I'm here, I'm nodding at you, and I'm laughing and nodding and realizing now that nobody can see that. But anyway,
right?
You're
like agreeing in silence.
Hey, I'm agreeing, and
it's a podcast.
It's a podcast. Okay. Anyway, so one of the other examples that I like is from Peter and Wendy by J.M. Barrie. Better known as Peter Pan.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes like this. Let me clear my throat. All children except one grow up. I mean, come on, drop the mic.
Hey, if I didn't know better, I'd say that was the opening to a great vampire story.
It does, but this opening line, it does make you wonder how they could be a child who never grows up, and I really think it does a good job at hooking you.
I don't wonder at all. I just assume he's a vampire.
But okay, fine. Well, I wonder.
But many great first lines are surprising, or they're so odd that we just have to know the rest.
And here's an example of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Which I love this quote too, but I can't do it because I can't say Gabriel Garcia Marquez the way you do.
What about the character's name? Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. What? The what? First off, he's facing a firing squad, but he's thinking about the time he went to discover ice. That attitude, it really makes you wonder.
Well, it does, because you have to ask yourself the question, or you just assume whatever this ice discovery is actually more important than his impending death. On a second note, had you not read the Colonel's name, I would probably read him in the story and just like give him a name like Colonel Bundy. Because yes. Buendia is just not going to be what I'm saying through,
Yeah, and and this has nothing to do with our actual topic, but maybe it does, because part of your first line in your beginning is your choice of words, and to me, discover eyes is strong. It makes a statement. Mm-hmm. But anyway,
first lines can also establish that it's a different world from what we know. For example, the opening line of George Orwell's 1984 reads, "It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. I mean, I love the visual of a clock with 13 hours. It just tells you you're in Bizarro land.
Oh my God, yes, I love that. I love that it's so. I know it's strange right away, mm-hmm. And my I can feel my pulse going up, my heart's racing. I don't know, and it kind of bleeds a little bit into the next point, which is first lines can capture the heart of the story. And I believe that those first lines and each opening chapter to follow are perhaps the most important. I think that within them lies the true heart of our story.
A great example of that is the opening to Stephen King's The Gunslinger, which reads, "The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed." If you follow through the entirety of his 7-book series, you realize that the entire series is summed up in that single beginning line. I mean, it's genius.
That is genius. I am so excited to see the movie later this year. It looks pretty cool.
I'll be that guy. I'm going to be the guy. Well, in the book, in the books. Well, in the books, right? There's going to be a lot of in the books.
No, you won't, because you don't like. Well, I don't know. You complain about people who do that.
I do, but I'm going to be that guy.
I am totally that girl when it comes to Harry Potter and Hunger Games, and I
probably
be the same girl when it comes to Creepers.
Being the only person on the planet who hasn't read the Harry Potter series, I have to sit in a house full of people on the holidays, my sons, my daughters, my wife, and have to hear constantly, although we've seen him 100 times, that's not what happens in the book. Well, in the book, Dobby is this, Dobby's star. It's like, guys, shut up. Let's just watch the movie.
I do the same thing to my husband, but I don't understand how you and I are friends since you've never read it. It's like, I feel like it should be illegal to be friends with people who haven't read the Harry Potter.
Well, trust me, enough people have told me what's in the book while I watch the movie that I feel like I have read it.
That's not the same thing.
Right. So to continue.
First line, in theory, are a simple process. Think of it this way. If the reader isn't hooked by your first line, she's really not going to read the opening paragraph.
Nope. And if he's not hooked by your opening paragraph, then the first page is wasted because nobody's going to bother turning over to the next page.
And if she's not hooked by your opening chapter, she won't read chapter 2. And then she's just going to put your book down and pick up Raymond's. Right. Or mine. No, I mean someone else's.
Well, let's just hope they all pick up mine. The point is, if the reader can't get past an uninspiring first line, the following thousands of amazing sentences that you may have wrote, they just might as well not exist. The perfect first sentence might come to you right away, or it could take you months.
I kind of feel like you're taking a jab at me there, but whatever, Some people need to finish the whole book first before figuring out the first line. Anyway, you'll know that you found your ideal first sentence when you stop trying to fix it. In other words, I'm being cliche here, but you will just know. It's going to feel almost unthinkable for you to start your novel any other way.
Yes, but of course, a great opener isn't just the first line. Beyond that, there are other important parts of that beginning. So what makes the great ones great? Well, that doesn't have any easy answer, but there are some helpful guidelines.
To grab readers, think of opening lines and paragraphs as being like meeting someone for the first time. You probably wouldn't be interested in getting to know a person who on the get-go starts telling you everything about themselves. And if they try to drag you in their personal drama right away, oh no, forget it.
Yeah. And if you meet that person, that's probably my stepsister. But instead, what you want is you want to learn enough or just enough about the person that you want to ask questions, and you want to learn more.
Get them to ask another question, then another, then another. But anyway, a good hook really is to start your novel when something changes outside of your protagonist's lives. Something that's going to force them to act.
Some call it the enticing incident, and it doesn't need to be overly dramatic or overly complicated. Readers don't need a long setup, and they don't want pages of backstory or information. They're smart. They know they need to read in order to catch up to what's going on.
Yeah, take Andy Weir's The Martian. It it begins with, "I'm pretty much fucked." That is my considered opinion. Fucked. 6 days into what should be the greatest 2 months of my life, and it's turned into a nightmare.
I love that Ware doesn't waste time starting with the crew landing on Mars or the setup that they used in the movie. He just starts right in the guts of the problem.
And the readers, they can see that something's changed in his life right away, which is now fucked. But most importantly, they're hooked with such simple statement.
In general, it's good, though, to avoid beginning with settings descriptions. Don't bore your readers with details that they haven't decided whether or not they care about. And perhaps the setting rule, if it is such, doesn't apply for science fiction or fantasy, because in that case, the reader is invested in these worlds.
So that's what we say in general. But another great piece of advice is to make your opening sentences unusual or unexpected.
As we said, write an opening that raises questions in a reader's mind, and their natural instinct will be to read on to find the answer.
Look, and of course, I can give examples without using one of my favorite authors, which we already discussed a little bit. But here's J.K. Rowling's first few lines from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stones. You want to read it for me, Raymond?
Yes, but it won't be like in the movie.
Damn it.
Mr. and Mrs.
I would love... No. You have to give me the... you have to give me the Harry Potter accent.
Can't do it.
Me neither.
Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were very proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense.
How brilliant that for such a magical novel, J.K. chose to begin with the least magical people in that whole story. Look, I feel it was genius. And I also think it was unusual, to point out that the Dursleys were proud to be normal. Thank you very much. So it's a great beginning for me.
It is. Another technique is to establish a unique voice.
Some of the greatest stories grab us because the voice of the main character is so different or interesting, or even bizarre at times, that, we can't help but want to learn more.
For example, here's the opening of Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. And she writes, "It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York. I'm stupid about executions. The idea of being executed makes me sick, and that's all there was to read about in the papers, Google-eyed headlines staring up at me on every street corner and at the fusty peanut-smelling mouth of every subway. It had nothing to do with me, but I couldn't help wondering what it would be like being burned alive along your nerves."
Yikes.
Miss Platt informs us immediately that our character has a much different way of looking at the world.
So the next point, to make it vivid. And, do more than just introduce us to the characters.
One of the reasons Brian Keene's The Rising resurrected the zombie genre was this vivid opening that tells us about the main character and the world he lives in a very haunting manner. The dead scrabble for an entrance to his grave. His wife was among them, as ravenous for Jim in death as she had been in life. Their faint, soulless cries drifted down through 10 feet of soil and rock.
Wow, that is awesome.
Yeah, so many things, like we're in a weird world, you even know that I think the most powerful part of that is, that Jim's wife, although she's a zombie now, truly loved him and needed him and wanted him in life.
Yeah,
it's almost romantic.
It is. It reminds me of that romantic meme that says, if I was a zombie, I'd save you for last. on the other end of that, you can also start with philosophical truth. Take the beginning of one of the best-selling books of all time, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness.
What's interesting to me is just how closely that parallels Genesis.
Yeah.
These great openers, they seem to share like a pace, a tempo, or even like a melody. There's something about them that's universal in sound and feel. On the other end of the spectrum is to simply start with humor.
Yes. So I usually do go with humor, which I think can be surprising because so many great lines are really funny. For example, here's Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Of course he must. How could he not?
Yeah, my grandfather had a similar saying. He said, no good deed goes unpunished.
Spoken by a man, of course.
Sometimes, though, it is easiest to understand the techniques to use by knowing what to avoid.
Yes. For example, please avoid using too much drama. Writers usually
like
believe
that whole introduction to using too much drama was a good example of using too much drama.
Look, no. You could do worse because you could totally do the whole thing with proper prose.
Yeah, that's true.
You could have given me a whole paragraph. Believe me, I know. Now, I joke, but you really are pretty poetic, and you could have given me that in proper prose, but it would have been beautiful. And please don't let that get to your head.
Mm-mm.
But anyway, using too much drama, it's really a no-no. Writers sometimes, believe that hooking readers means starting with some big event, something huge. But the problem with starting like this is that, nothing is at stake yet. And the reader is just not invested in a character at this point.
Yeah, it sounds a little cruel, but if the reader hasn't been introduced to the characters, beginning with a funeral or a hospital scene is kind of pointless. I mean, there's just no emotional investment, and it can just come across as being monotonous.
Another thing to avoid is taking too long to get into the story.
Yeah, in marketing, there's a saying, and it's don't bury the lead, which means don't lose the main point in a bunch of introductory nonsense. You don't want the good part of your story to start in chapter 3.
Yeah, look, man, easing into the story with modern readers, that's a bad idea. Like, they just don't have the attention span. And as writers, we need to get to the point as quickly as possible and avoid getting too caught up in, in the settings and the info dumps and stuff like that.
Yeah, and a third thing to avoid is you have to be careful with flashbacks and inner demons. Many new writers, in wanting to explain why their characters are who they are, begin with a lot of telling and flashbacks. But in truth, as we said, the readers they don't care that soon.
In the story, you can reveal the character was abused or, or whatever, but that's later in the story. The beginning is just not the place for that.
Yeah, that happened to me twice. I talk about Stephen King because he was my, beginning inspiration. I loved him. But in 2 of his books, The Dead Zone and Salem's Lot, both which turned out to be great novels, I picked up and put down several times because I found those openings just so damn boring. And although I've read both of those books 3 or 4 times, in every subsequent reading, I skip the prologue. Because it's still boring.
That's the thing is, readers don't need all of that backstory right away. They're perfectly fine with meeting a full-grown adult character with all of his flaws, and, they just go with it. Actually, wondering why a character thinks or acts a certain way, it can drive the reader to turn pages hoping that it's going to eventually be explained.
And fourth, I think the greatest cautionary tale is overused openings and cliches. If it's been said or done before, then just don't do it. If they've read it 100 times, the reader's going to close the book. If they feel cheated because your character just had that dream and woke up, they're going to close the book.
And sometimes they're going to even close the book if the character dies in the first chapter. The thing is, why are you going to invest your time if you know the end of this person?
But these are just guidelines. If you can put a new spin on an old technique and pull it off, then, by all means, go for it.
Yeah, if it works for your story, it works. Even if it breaks a rule. And, really, that's the only rule I always stand by.
So to summarize, The first page, the first paragraph, and the first sentence of your novel may be more heavily revised than any other part of your book.
Since we all agree the first chapter is so important, we've decided to showcase the best of the best with our chapter of excellence contest.
Absolutely. If you think your first chapter is a killer,
Or if you'd like to find out if it is,
this is your chance to sign up and to win one of 3 awards in your genre.
and we're not cheap, one author will win the grand prize of $250.
Hey, and here's the best part. We're also going to select an author from the winners to be a featured interview on the Writers Podcast. And this is going to be their opportunity to talk about their first chapter, their book, and their writing journey.
An entry is simple and affordable at just $15.
You're not going to find a contest at a lower price. And that's because we're not looking to burden authors with the cost of a contest. We really want to get excited and see the best of the best. So to enter, just visit writersafterdark.net, go to our entry page, and fill out the very short form.
And don't miss your chance to show readers your excellence.
Yeah, if you believe in that first chapter, then enter today and show us what you got.
Thank you for listening to the Writers Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. For more articles, news, and advice, visit our website, writersafterdark.net, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The Writers Podcast is a Writers After Dark radio production. Executive producers SK Anthony and Raymond Esposito. Copyright 2017.